The mist moved like breath from a sleeping god, low and silver across the forest floor. Above the canopy, a sliver of moonlight pierced the branches, illuminating frost-laced leaves that hung motionless in the hush before dawn. Beneath an ancient oak, its roots like gnarled hands gripping the earth, a girl knelt in silence, her fingers tracing the faint grooves of sacred stones, worn smooth by the prayers of generations. She was alone, though the woods held memories older than names. The air was rich with damp moss and ash, like the scent of funerals and winter hearths. Ain, barely 17, draped in a woolen cloak the color of river silt, was not merely a druid's niece. She was a vessel. A whisperer between worlds. The sacred grove she entered barefoot each morning held more than ceremony, it held her mother's voice, the rustle of her laughter in the trees, lost to fever years ago. Somewhere far off, a bell rang from a forgotten shrine, its echo trembling like a cracked bone flute across the hollow valley. The note carried through the oaks, through the marrow of the stones, through the base of Ain's spine. It was the hour of listening. The stones beneath her fingers were carved with ogham, slanted lines like slashes on skin. They spoke of old laws, of pacts sealed in blood and sap. She had learned the meaning of each mark in hushed tones beside the fire, her uncle's voice trembling only once, when he spoke of the Roman gods, whose temples smelled of oil and death. The grove had changed since the legions came. Trees once left untouched were felled in silence. The wild boar paths had narrowed. The rivers that once ran clear now carried dust from distant roads. And still the invaders claimed peace, offering bread while unsheathing blades beneath their cloaks. Ain stood, knees stiff from the cold earth. She reached into the fold of her cloak and pulled forth a torque, bronze, heavy, inlaid with spiral markings that mirrored the swirl of wind and water. It had once belonged to her grandfather, who fell beneath a Roman spear at Gergovia, his body left exposed for birds. Now the torque waited again to be worn. She turned as a shadow approached, hooded, silent, feet muffled by the moss. No words passed between them. He held out a scroll sealed with wax, its crest that of the eagle. Her hand did not tremble as she took it, though the wax burned against her skin. She did not read it. She knew already what it said. The Romans would come to the council fire. They would bring translators with honeyed tongues, and soldiers with iron smiles. They would speak of treaties and trade, but behind every word hung a blade. Ain turned back toward the oak. At its base, a bundle of dried herbs waited, mugwort, mistletoe, yew. She scattered them into a clay bowl and struck flint against steel, her thumb already nicked and bleeding. The spark caught, and a flame rose, small and golden, trembling like a heartbeat. Smoke curled around her shoulders. It clung to her hair like a veil, mingling with the scent of burnt leaves and old blood. She whispered in Gaulish, a tongue that did not belong in Roman courts, a tongue that smelled of soil and bone. Her prayer was not for victory, but for memory, to remember the taste of acorn bread, the rhythm of wooden flutes, the laughter of children around maypoles. The torque slipped over her neck, cold against her collarbones. It did not fit cleanly, it pressed like burden. She imagined the torque as a binding rope, as a collar, as a crown. The weight of it rooted her to the earth, and to the dead who walked invisibly behind her. Wind passed through the trees, gentle at first, then stronger, as if the forest exhaled. Somewhere to the north, a raven called once, twice. A bad omen, her uncle would say. A sign of watchers unseen. Ain turned to leave the grove. The grass beneath her feet was stiff with frost, each blade snapping faintly as she walked. She crossed beneath the low-hanging limbs of elder and ash, and paused where a deer path cut through the underbrush. The rising light caught her profile, sharp cheekbones, eyes hollowed from weeks of restless sleep. She did not cry. Not here. At the edge of the woods, a horse waited, tethered to a post carved with spiral runes. Its breath steamed in the chill, its flanks quivering. Ain approached, placing her hand against its muzzle, whispering to calm it. The scroll remained clutched in her other hand. As she mounted, the forest behind her shimmered, not with magic, but with memory. The grove would not survive the coming months. Already Roman axes bit deeper into sacred trees. Already the rivers choked with silt from new roads and aqueducts. But the forest had gifted her something the legions could not understand. A stillness. A knowing. A truth buried not in books, but in bark and bone. The path ahead wound through mist and shadow, past ruined shrines and half-burnt watchposts. At the summit, she paused. Below, the valley stretched wide, dotted with smoking hearths and silent fields. In the far distance, like a jagged wound across the earth, the Roman camp stood, orderly, cruel, disciplined. Red standards flapped in the wind, each one marked with the image of the eagle. A god that demanded silence. Ain held the scroll aloft, then let it fall into the grass. The seal broke on impact, scattering wax like dried blood. She would deliver her answer not with words, but with the look in her eyes when she faced them. She turned her gaze toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to rise behind the hills, casting pale gold across the frost. The torque at her throat gleamed like a chain, or a halo. Behind her, the bell rang again, faint and distant. This was not the end. Not yet. There were still stories buried in the mud. Still prayers to be spoken. Still fires to be lit before the long winter came. She would ride down into the valley not as a girl, not as a druid's niece, but as a living question. A voice the Romans could not quiet. A silence they would learn to fear. And as the frost cracked under hoof and the wind rose again, it carried with it a sound not heard in years, a second voice beneath the bell. A chant, rising softly from the trees. Faint. Defiant. Ancient. The door closed like a sentence. Heavy, final, lined with iron rivets that had turned brown from years of storm. The echo of it lingered in the chieftain's hall like a warning, bouncing between wooden beams and thick stone walls. In that silence, firelight danced against the carved faces of long-dead ancestors, their eyes black with shadow. Cian stood just inside, the scent of rain still clinging to his woolen cloak, his boots dripping mud onto the rush-covered floor. He did not speak yet. Not out of fear, but reverence. He had returned from the edge of the world, from the land where Roman roads cut through the hills like wounds, where foreign drums beat through the night. His cloak was torn, his legs bruised from hidden ditches, his fingers wrapped around the shaft of a hunting spear not used for hunting. But more than that, he had returned with the shape of danger behind his eyes. A bowl was passed to him. Sour milk, thick and cool, edged with the faint tang of wood smoke. He drank, letting it slide down his throat like memory. Around him, warriors stood with arms folded, faces marked with soot and clay, waiting. The hall was lit by torches wedged into iron rings, each one hissing quietly, as if uneasy in their flames. The air was heavy with pine pitch, dog fat, and ash. Somewhere beneath it all, the scent of iron. Blood had been spilled here not long ago. That much, Cian could tell. He unrolled the crude hide map, smoothed it out over the nearest table. His knuckles bore fresh scrapes. The skin split and swollen. He pointed with a broken twig to a series of dark marks drawn in haste, Roman outposts, cavalry patrols, timber watchtowers strung together like teeth in a mouth that was closing. The legions were not waiting anymore. They were moving. They are building in circles, he said quietly, almost to himself. They mean to starve us from the inside. One of the elders grunted, a sound between disbelief and fear. Cian's voice did not rise. He was not a man who needed volume to be heard. He gestured again, this time to a river bend marked by 2 crosses. There are already graves there. Burnt fields. A mother's dress nailed to a door. The fire cracked. A single coal leapt from the flames and died on the stone floor. No one moved. Outside, the wind shifted. The sound of geese echoed from the flooded marshes, a lonely, broken call that bled through the hall's slatted windows. It was the sound of autumn, of things retreating, of the world preparing to be buried under frost. Cian listened, heart thudding in rhythm with the call. His dreams had been filled with that sound on the ride home. He had seen villages empty except for rats, fire pits grown cold, tiny shoes left in doorways. A woman stepped forward from the shadows. She did not speak at first. Her presence cut through the hush like a blade. Her cloak was dark with rain, its hem crusted with dirt. A raven feather gleamed near her collar, pinned by a brooch of dull silver shaped like a crescent moon. She looked at Cian, and for a long time, said nothing. Then she raised her hand, and touched the side of his face, just once, just enough to feel the heat beneath his skin. Her fingers smelled of herbs, mugwort, sage, and something older. Her words were soft, in Gaulish, but clear. You walked through shadows to carry the light back. He nodded, unsure of what to say. In her eyes, he saw something he had lost along the road. Not hope, exactly. But steadiness. The kind that doesn't crack when the gods go silent. She brought forth a bowl of milk and wine, and without ceremony, pricked her finger over it. The drop of blood was small but vivid. It spiraled down into the white liquid like ink. She dipped her own finger in, then held it out. Cian did the same. They touched. The oath was made. Behind them, the warriors watched, but none spoke. Some averted their eyes. Oaths like that were older than the language used to describe them. A gust of wind pushed through the hall, lifting soot from the hearth and setting a candle to flicker violently. The shadows along the carved beams began to sway, ravens, boars, wolves. The animals of their forebears, stirred from sleep. And then came the sound. Faint. Distant. A horn, low and mournful, moaning across the hills. Cian stiffened. Not ours. It came again, louder this time. Not a call to war. A signal of arrival. Outside the hall, torches flared to life. Feet began to move in the courtyard. Spears clinked. Dogs barked once and then fell silent, unsure whether to run or fight. Cian stepped toward the door, and the woman, whose name he did not know, followed. The wind met them first, sharp and wet. The rain had turned to sleet. In the torchlight, the snowflakes looked like ash. At the far gate, a rider approached, armor darkened with river mud, cloak tattered. He carried no banner. No insignia. Just a folded parchment wrapped in leather and bound with gut string. He dismounted slowly, his knees barely holding. In his eyes, fear, not for himself, but for what he carried. Cian took the message. His hands did not shake. He opened it, and read the Latin aloud, though it cracked in his throat like flint on stone. You are summoned to submit. No conditions. No offers. Only a command. The woman beside him reached for her feathered brooch and unclasped it. It fell into the mud, unnoticed by anyone but her. Cian looked to the sky. Somewhere above the clouds, the stars remained. Watching. Distant. Unmoved. He turned to the rider. You'll tell them we heard. The rider swallowed, nodded, and backed away. As Cian returned to the hall, he passed a torch left unlit. He stopped. Took the oil-soaked cloth. And with flint and blade, he struck a spark. The flame caught. The light did not push away the shadows. It made them deeper. But it burned. And it would carry through the dark. Far off, beyond the flooded marshes and the Roman roads, a girl in a sacred grove was slipping a bronze torque over her neck. The same wind that chilled his face now tugged at her cloak. The story was no longer his alone. It was becoming something larger. Something dangerous. Something unspoken, until now, the sky cracked open before dawn, not with thunder, but with silence. A stillness so total it seemed unnatural, like the pause of breath before a blade falls. Low fog slid along the ground, pale as breath on iron. And through it came the sound of hooves, slow, deliberate, the rhythm of inevitability. Frost crunched beneath the hooves like bones beneath cloth. A standard fluttered in the mist, its crimson edge soaked darker by rain. The eagle, wings stretched wide, dripping with dew, crowned a procession that did not march, but swallowed. In the village of Tello, doors had been barred since the night before. Fires were doused early. Bread was left half-baked, goats unmilked, children hushed. Word had traveled faster than horses, the Romans were coming not for negotiation, but for possession. An old man stood alone outside the palisade. His back was bent with years of winter, and his tunic patched with wool dyed from lichen and nettle. His name was Corvos, though few called him that anymore. Most simply said, he remembers. And he did. He remembered when the sky was not divided by Roman gods. When the moon was a mother, not a measurement. When children danced around sacred wells instead of hiding beneath floorboards. He did not kneel when the Romans arrived. The officer who approached was young, his armor too polished, his cloak still red with dye, not blood. His voice trembled only once as he read the decree: Tello was now subject to tribute. Grain. Livestock. Men. Corvos did not answer. He only looked past the soldier, to where a boy of no more than 12 clutched a wooden blade in the doorway of a roundhouse, his face half covered by the shadow of a thatched roof. That was the only reply he gave. The Romans moved quickly. Efficiently. They catalogued. They calculated. They left behind ink where the Gauls had left behind blood. Wax seals in place of ash. Orders in place of prayer. But not everyone bent. In a stone outpost above the riverbank, a woman prepared her child for what might come next. Her hands shook only when tying the leather cords of the boy's cloak. Her son, 7 winters old, watched her with wide eyes that had not yet learned to fear completely. She placed in his palm a small stone carved with a spiral. A token. A promise. Her father had given it to her during the famine years, when the gods seemed to sleep. Now she passed it on like a torch made of memory. "They don't know these hills," she whispered. He nodded, though he did not yet understand. At the edge of the village, in a barn that once held hay but now sheltered the sick, a fevered girl sang to herself in the old tongue. Her breath was thin, her limbs cold, but her voice carried strangely through the slats in the walls. It wove between the torches of the patrol, unsettling the Roman horses, who pawed the earth and snorted into the fog. The centurion ordered her silenced. But even after she stopped breathing, the melody did not end. It lingered. In the frost. In the reeds. In the heartbeat of those who had once danced to it beneath stars no Roman could name. By nightfall, the census was complete. Lists inked and rolled. Tributes demanded. Those who could not speak Latin were marked with chalk on the forehead, silent accusations. The soldiers did not burn the village. That was not the Roman way, not here, not yet. But they left behind something colder, the knowledge that submission would be expected, over and over, until even memory obeyed. Corvos stood again in the square as they departed. He did not move as they passed. One soldier, perhaps no older than the boy with the wooden sword, paused for a moment. Looked into the elder's eyes. And then looked away. The silence after their departure was thick with what had not been said. Women returned to homes that no longer felt like their own. Men inspected their tools not as farmers, but as prisoners. And children watched the road for hours, waiting for something unnamed to return. That night, under a sky crusted with stars, a fire was lit behind the old stone altar at the edge of the woods. Not in defiance, but in remembering. The flame crackled as if trying to speak. One by one, the villagers came. A handful at first. Then more. No drums. No horns. Just footsteps in mud and frost. They brought tokens, a child's tooth wrapped in cloth, a doll carved from bone, a dried sprig of juniper. They placed them by the flame. Corvus stepped forward last. From beneath his cloak, he drew a curved blade, bronze, chipped with age. He did not raise it. He placed it in the earth, blade first, beside the fire. "We remember," he said. The words were old. Older than war. Older than Latin. The others repeated them, not loudly, but clearly. Their breath rose in the cold night like the smoke of a forgotten offering. Far from the altar, in a Roman camp on the southern ridge, the young centurion wrote his report by torchlight. He noted the village's compliance. Its population. Its potential yield. He sealed it with wax. Folded it. And for a moment, only a moment, he paused. Then he reached into his satchel and pulled out a strip of cloth, a child's ribbon, smudged with soot. He tucked it beneath the scroll. Said nothing. In the trees beyond the ridge, eyes watched. Quiet. Waiting. Not with rage. With time. Because time was the one thing the Gauls had learned to wield without steel. The river still moved. The stones still whispered. The fire still burned behind the altar, unseen by Romans, untouched by order. And in the northern hills, where the frost never quite left the ground, a new gathering was taking shape, strangers meeting in ruins once thought forgotten. Their torches low. Their voices hushed. Their hands calloused. But their hearts still loud with a single rhythm, not yet. Not all is lost. Not yet, the wind carried the ash long before the fire had finished burning. It drifted past the tree line in strange, slow spirals, gray flecks that looked like snowflakes but stung the eyes. The forest stood silent as the smoke rose behind it, thick and bitter, coating the pine needles with the taste of charred wood and bone. Somewhere beyond the flames, a house once stood. Not a palace. Not a fort. Just a roundhouse of thatch and timber, with herbs drying on its rafters and bread cooling in its hearth, until it was marked with a Roman X. The woman who had once cooked in that house now ran barefoot through the underbrush, the soles of her feet bloodied from thorns and frost. Her name was Irene, daughter of no one important. No banners bore her clan. No druid spoke her lineage. But in her chest burned a rage older than law. She had not screamed when they dragged her brother from the hut. She had not pleaded when the centurion laughed and kicked her father's ashes into the dirt. She had watched, silent, still, memorizing the lines of their faces and the weight of their blades. Now, she ran, not in flight, but in memory. Each breath drew in the forest's cold. Each step broke branches once gathered for kindling. She clutched a bundle wrapped in linen, its edges damp from her tears and from the morning dew. Not a weapon. Not yet. Beneath the canopy, the world closed in. Owls blinked from high nests. A fox vanished into shadow. The forest here had always been sacred, untouched by plow or fire. A place of burial and birth, where trees grew twisted and the air smelled of peat and secrets. And in a clearing near the heart of it, Irene fell to her knees. The earth was soft with moss. She unwrapped the linen bundle slowly, reverently. Inside, a boy's carved amulet, broken down the center. A half-charred braid of her mother's hair. A small dagger with no edge, blunt with age, but once carried by her grandfather into the marsh battles of the old days. She pressed each item into the soil, burying them with her bare hands. Not as offerings. As anchors. Proof that they had lived. A branch cracked behind her. She did not flinch. From the shadows emerged a figure cloaked in green wool, hood pulled low, face marked with ochre. Not Roman. Not exactly friend. He said nothing, but extended a hand. In his palm, a piece of bark, etched with spiral markings and lines of old script. An invitation. She took it, her eyes never leaving his. He turned, and she followed. Together they moved through the thickets, past hidden symbols carved into tree trunks, past stones wrapped in twine and black feathers. The signs of a world that refused to die. They came to a hollow beneath a rocky overhang, where smoke curled faintly from a narrow vent. Inside, shadows moved. Iron ducked low and entered. It was no army that waited within. No flags. No steel. Just a gathering of eyes, young, hollowed by hunger and fire. Old, rimmed with grief and knowledge. A child clung to a dog. A man with only one arm sharpened sticks into points. A woman braided long strands of nettle into rope. It was not resistance in the Roman sense. There were no maps. There were no scrolls. But it was memory. And it was waiting. An elder rose from the shadows. Her voice was soft but carved from stone. You come with flame behind you. Iron nodded. And what lies before you? She looked down at her hands, raw from the earth. She did not answer. The elder handed her a bowl of water steeped in pine needles and salt. Iron drank. The bitterness brought tears to her eyes, but it cleared something in her chest. A silence unnaughted. A vow she hadn't yet spoken. She began to speak, not loudly, not for them, but for the dead who could no longer form their own names. She told of the house. Of the soldier who smelled of wine and horse grease. Of the way the fire took first the rafters, then the bed, then the small wooden flute her brother had carved the summer before. She did not cry. But the others listened. And in their silence, something sacred stirred. The elder nodded, and passed her a scrap of leather, thin, circular, punched with small holes. A sigil. A mark of one who remembers and cannot forget. She took it. Tied it to the braid in her hair. Outside, the sky was beginning to shift, dawn bleeding through the ash clouds, turning them from black to rust to dull gold. The wind had changed again. No longer just smoke. There was salt in it now. From the coast. From ships. Roman banners moved on the southern ridge. Columns of men in formation. Walls of shields, gleaming like a lie told too many times. But the forest did not bow. And beneath it, in roots and rivers, in caves and clearings, something old was rising. Not vengeance. Not war. Something stranger. A kind of remembering that could not be killed. Not by steel. Not by scroll. Not even by silence. Iron stepped outside, breath steaming in the cold. In her hand now, not the broken relics of her family, but a curved blade resharpened by someone else's hand. The edge caught the first light of morning. In the trees, a raven called. And far to the north, where the frost lay thickest and the stones whispered most clearly, a horn was being carved from stag bone. Its mouth wide. Its call not yet made. But soon. Soon, the world would hear it. It began with a silence too heavy to be natural. The kind of silence that presses against the ribs and flattens the breath, as if the world itself were holding something in. No birdsong. No rustling. Only the whisper of wind pushing through the stones of the abandoned oppidum on the hill. Below, the river ran black with twilight, slow and swollen. In the reeds, a boy crouched, watching the fortress that no longer belonged to his people. His face was streaked with mud and ash, his hands trembling not from fear, but from cold and hunger. He was the last of his household. The rest were ash scattered across their field or broken under hooves on the road. His name was Meleir. 11 winters old, but already ancient with knowing. He had not come here for shelter. He had come to witness. To mark the passing of what once was. The oppidum, once ringed with timber palisades and the gold of trade, now stood gutted. Roman watchfires burned in its corners, low and controlled, like the eyes of beasts who knew they could not be challenged. The wooden beams of its gatehouse sagged with rot, its hearths cold but catalogued. This was no siege. This was administration. The Gauls had not been slaughtered here, they had been counted, renamed, taxed, tamed. And that, somehow, was worse. Meleager did not weep. He chewed a strip of dried root, bitter as guilt, and waited for the moon to rise above the smoke. From the opposite slope, the sound of hooves emerged, slow, measured. A single rider. Not Roman. No gleaming armor, no crest. Just a cloak of dark green, riding a pony with shagged mane and foam at the mouth. She dismounted quietly, tying the reins to a hawthorn tree. Her name was Avara. Born on the coast, trained in shadows. One of the last messengers still walking between broken tribes, bearing news in whispers and in scars. She sat beside Meleager without asking. Offered him a bundle of roasted barley and soft goat cheese wrapped in fern. He did not speak. But he ate. "The gates are open," she said. He nodded. "And still they do not leave. They've forgotten the forest," he said. "They believe they belong now." Inside. Avara looked at the fire-lit hill and said nothing. The Romans had begun erecting columns near the center, markers of order, of gods who arrived in stone rather than spirit. She had seen them before. Marble altars with Latin names, cold and perfect. But they did not sing. They did not weep. They did not bleed when the rain fell. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a string of beads, amber, polished smooth, passed down from a priestess who had once danced barefoot in fire. She placed it in the boy's palm. "Take it to the girl who still remembers. The one in the stone cave by the salt marsh." Meleager stared at it. "She's real. She's waiting." Below them, torches were lit in ritual cadence. The Romans had learned enough to mimic. They paraded symbols through the oppidum, standards, laurel crowns, censers of imported resin. Smoke rose in tidy spirals. Words were spoken in Latin, full of confidence and clarity. But not one heart beat faster in awe. This was not reverence. It was routine. A theater of dominance. Meleager stood. He stepped toward the edge of the slope, where grass turned to shale. From beneath his tunic, he pulled a carved horn, capped with bronze, engraved with spirals. He did not blow it. He simply held it up. Avara's eyes narrowed. "Now." He nodded. "They burned my sister's body for warmth." She closed her eyes for one breath. Then she stood too. Far to the west, where the fields dipped into fog, a shadow moved. Then another. Then a line. Figures rising from behind stones and from within ruined groves. They carried no banners. They bore no shields. But they had fire in their hands. Torches soaked in tallow. Wrapped in the fabric of lost kin. Avara placed her hand on Meleager's shoulder. "You start it." The boy stepped forward. He raised the horn. And blew. It was not a war cry. It was not beautiful. It was broken. Wounded. But it echoed. Across the valley. Through the branches. Between the stones of the Roman gates. Down in the oppidum, a soldier froze. He had heard it once before, long ago, when his cohort marched through the mountains of the north and found only bones arranged in circles. He turned, eyes wide. His hand moved to his sword. Not from orders. From instinct. The fires outside flared. And suddenly, the world was no longer silent. A scream pierced the air, not from a throat, but from flame, from soil, from the ghosts of those who had swallowed their tongues in the name of survival. The Gauls did not charge. They did not storm. They surrounded. They waited. They let the fear rot from the inside. Meleager lowered the horn, chest heaving. He watched as the light from their torches cast twisted shadows across the Roman columns. He saw the way the statues wavered. As if uncertain of their own meaning. He did not smile. He simply turned back into the woods, the amber beads clenched in his fist, and vanished. Avara stayed a moment longer. Watching. Measuring. Remembering. Then she, too, melted into the darkness. The oppidum would not fall that night. But it would no longer feel untouchable. And far to the east, in the salt marsh caves where the tide licked the bones of ancient offerings, a girl with white hair traced her fingers along the wall, where symbols had been scratched generations ago. A spiral. A horn. A hand. She felt them warm beneath her touch. And she waited. The first snow did not fall like a blessing, it fell like a burial. It crept in silence across the ridgelines and cloaked the valleys without warning. It covered the tracks of messengers, erased the bones of the fallen, softened the ruined fields that once grew barley and oats. There was no beauty in it. Only finality. And on a narrow trail between two broken settlements, a figure moved through the white. Hood drawn low. A staff in one hand, marked with twine and iron nails. The other hand clutched a pouch tied shut with sinew, the contents warm from body heat but heavy with consequence. The woman's name was Lysenna. Some called her a seer. Some a traitor. Others did not call her anything, for her name was never spoken aloud when fires were lit. She had once stood beneath the sacred oak of Carnu, back when Gauls still dared to whisper its gods aloud. Now, she walked alone, her footprints vanishing behind her as quickly as they formed. Ahead, the remains of a gathering place, once filled with voice and rite, now repurposed by the Roman garrison as a supply outpost. The banner of the eagle flapped lazily above the entrance, its red dye dulled by the frost. A soldier sat slumped by the doorway, helmet in his lap, knuckles split from cold. He did not see her pass. Or perhaps he did, and chose silence. She had come not to fight, but to retrieve what had been hidden. Years before, when the last true druids were hunted like wolves, a relic had been buried beneath the floor of the stone hall. Not gold. Not scrolls. A simple woven vessel, sealed in resin, holding fragments of bark inscribed with prayers. The last known words of 3 bloodlines that had resisted erasure for generations. Inside the ruined hall, the fire had long since gone out. Lysenna stepped through the shattered door. She moved with purpose, yet each step was reverent, as if walking through a graveyard that still remembered the names carved into its stones. Under the crumbling altar, beneath a flagstone loosened by water and time, she dug with her bare hands. The dirt was cold, but not frozen. The gods, it seemed, had kept it soft for her. She found it wrapped in wool, now fraying. The vessel was intact. Her breath caught, not from exertion, but from memory. She held the object close, and for a moment, in the stillness, she heard singing. Not aloud. Not in the ears. But in the chest. In the place where old languages slept, waiting for tongues bold enough to carry them again. She turned to leave. But outside, the snow had stopped. And standing beneath the threshold was a young man in Roman armor. His face was not cruel, but carved with the lines of duty. His eyes flicked to the object in her hand. Then to her face. He said nothing. And neither did she. Only the wind spoke between them. After a long moment, he stepped aside. Perhaps he had lost a sister to a sickness the Romans could not cure. Perhaps he had heard stories from his grandmother that made him doubt the gods he was ordered to serve. Or perhaps he simply knew that this woman, wrapped in rags, carried something that should not die yet. She passed him. And the relic passed with her. Days later, beneath a canopy of black pines in the north, Lysenna knelt before a circle of children. They wore no armor. They spoke in fragments. Some could not yet read. But their eyes did not blink as she unwrapped the vessel. One by one, she pulled the bark strips into the light. She did not translate. She let them look. Let them touch. And something passed through the circle that no torch could mimic. The words were not weapons. But they cut through despair. Names of rivers. Names of stars. Curses and blessings spoken in the same breath. One girl, not more than 9, reached forward and traced a line across the bark. Her finger trembled as she repeated the sound. Lysenna watched. And for the first time in many moons, she allowed herself to hope. Because this was not resistance. It was resurrection. Elsewhere, the Roman machines continued their work. Roads were laid. Temples built. Markets opened. The empire, bloated with confidence, believed itself eternal. But in corners of frost, in forests the legions dared not enter after dusk. Language took root again. Not loudly. But deeply. In song. In symbols carved into cave walls. In lullabies passed from mother to daughter by firelight. And beneath the snow, the land remembered. So did the stones. So did the bones of the dead. They did not cry out. They waited. Because the Gauls had learned what empires forget, that silence, when shared, becomes strength. That memory, when whispered, becomes armor. That the cold is not death. It is preservation. And in the distance, beyond the marshes and the broken towers, a boy with amber beads tied around his wrist ran toward the salt caves, a message clenched in his fist. Behind him, the snow began to melt.